Hello everybody, welcome to Chapter 8 pertaining to economic growth. In the last chapter we looked at GDP, and in this chapter we're going to look at GDP growth and what actually drives economic growth, modern economic growth, which remember started around the time of the Industrial Revolution, what drives growth, how do we account for it, what have been some recent fluctuations in the average rate of growth, and finally, is growth desirable and sustainable? So economic growth can be measured in two ways. The first is an increase in real GDP over a time period, and the second is an increase in real GDP per capita over a time period. Remember, real GDP is the overall size of the economy adjusted for inflation, and real GDP per capita is the amount of the economy per person. We divide GDP by population. So we can see if both grow. Real GDP can grow, but if your population is growing at a tremendous rate, well then real GDP per capita may not be growing as well. So we look at growth as a percentage rate, and the goal of any economy since the Industrial Revolution has been continued and sustained growth. That is a very important point. And in regard to growth, we have what is known as our rule of 70. Meaning if we take the number 70 and divide it by our annual percentage rate of growth, so let's say we're growing at 2%, it would take 35 years in that case to double our GDP. So if we divide 70 by whatever percent of growth we're growing at, that's how long it'll take to double GDP. If we're growing at 7%, we would double our GDP in 10 years. In the United States, for instance, from 1950 to 2018, our GDP increased by more than 8 times. We were growing at about a clip of 3.1% per year, and that is in real numbers, adjusting for inflation. Our real GDP per capita increased about 4 times, the reason being our population now is much greater than it was in 1950. So you're dividing by a larger population, but real GDP per capita also grew around 4 times or 2% a year. And the takeaway from any form of economic growth is the following. You get better products and services. Think of how all of our technological products have improved and everything else. Added leisure time as you get growth and more varied jobs. Generally, more vacation and leisure time becomes part of it. And also time savings from technology. And finally, other impacts of growth. Better quality of life, better standard of living, better medical care. All of that pertains to economic growth. So if we look here, real GDP and real GDP per capita, this is just a selection of this country's real GDP. Everything, as you can see here, has been adjusted to 2012 dollars. So once again, anytime you compare GDPs, you always have to set them to a common dollar amount. So all of these are in 2012 dollars, 1950 to 2018. And we've had steady growth in both cases. And our population in 1950, it's since a little more than doubled from 152 million to about 327 million now. But it's certainly not growing at the rate it was during the baby boom years. So modern growth, as we touched upon previously, began with the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, not necessarily modern, but modern at the time, equipment started to come about, steam power, factories, equipment like that, and that allowed rapid, sustainable growth. And from the Industrial Revolution, we got all of the technologies we take for granted now. So since then, modern growth has been characterized by sustained and ongoing increases in standard of living. Before industrialization, every country was pretty much farming based, and some were more powerful than others, but you didn't really see very much growth. And once we had industrialization, we started to see rapid changes in growth. Ongoing increases in standard of living, more leisure time, social change, generally democratic forms of government come out of economic growth. The more modern and powerful an economy is, generally, but not always, you can get more free forms of government, and also increases in technology have more than doubled human lifespan since industrialization. So all of these things have come out of in modern growth. The Industrial Revolution once again started in Great Britain, but it didn't spread evenly. So some countries rapidly industrialized within the beginning of the 1800s, and others are still in the process of industrializing now. So as a consequence, the starting date is generally your main cause of your difference in standard of living. Catching up is possible. Countries that industrialized long ago are considered leader countries. So the United States, for instance, they generally invent technologies. Follower countries adopt technologies and then can grow faster and then start inventing their own. In the 1960s, China was a following country. They are now a leader country themselves. So it's entirely possible for follower countries to become leader countries and among the most powerful economies in the world. So if we look at the following chart, this will prove what we're going through. So this is just an example of different countries and regions and their changes in standard of living. Note at the beginning of the 1800s, there really wasn't much difference. Now there are giant differences between various countries and different continents as well. And this is all based on when did these countries start industrializing. So let's take a look here at what actually fosters growth. Strong property rights are important. So to be able to buy plant, product, and equipment, your property, all of that, that is important for growth. To be able to have private property. Patents and copyrights are very important for growth. Remember, intellectual property, inventing new things, that is what drives a lot of growth. Having the ability to legally protect your inventions is very important. If you couldn't patent or copyright anything, there really wouldn't be any desire to invent something new because someone could just rip it off. So patents and copyrights are very important. Efficient financial institutions. We're going to touch upon the role of financial institutions in the economy later in this class, but if a country has a broken banking system that doesn't work, you're not going to have an economy that grows or is particularly functional. We need financial institutions to grant loans and allow credit and processing of checks and money and all of that. Literacy and widespread education. Education is incredibly important for growth. Literacy, or the ability to read, and continued education is very important for your society to keep growing. Free trade, we're going to touch more upon trade in later chapters, but the ability to trade is very important. Trade allows countries to specialize in the goods and services that they make best, and then trade with those who make things different better than them, so everybody gets a better mix of goods and services than they could make themselves. And finally, we need competitive markets. Markets where people are freely able to buy and sell and enter into business and all of that. So on our supply side, what will actually drive growth? Well, if we find increases in quantity and quality of natural resources, so if we find a new source of oil, or we find a new source of lithium to make batteries, that's going to lead to growth. Or if we find a better quality of these products, a way to extract them better, or more inexpensive, or more efficiently, or all of the above, anytime we have more natural resources or better natural resources, we're going to be able to grow. Increase in quality and quantity of human resources. Well, quantity was when populations were greatly increasing, but in most developed nations, that's not the case anymore. So, although having more employees is always going to, or more possible employees is always going to lead to growth, we are more focused on, in this country, on quality, and that's your education. Better training, better education. Far more people now have college degrees than they did 20, 30 years ago. That's a good thing. The more educated your workforce, the more growth we will be able to achieve. Increase in the supply of capital goods. Remember, capital goods drive growth. So that's your plant, product, and equipment and new inventions and all of that stuff. The more of them we have on hand, the more we'll grow as well. And also the biggest one, improvements in technology. Technology is the biggest driver of growth in modern nations. Think of all of the new technologies you've experienced in your life and all of the things that come out of them. So smartphones brought apps and all of the things we could use those apps for. For instance, anytime we get improvements in technology, we wind up growing. So, to be able to grow, we need two things. Number one, we need demand. So, growing means more production. Remember, GDP is a function of production. We measure it in dollars. So, if our economy is growing, we're producing more. To be able to have that growth be sustainable, households, businesses, and the government have to purchase that expanding output. We're growing, we're making more stuff. We have to be able to buy it. If not, we're not actually growing. And second, we need what is known as the efficiency factor. And the efficiency factor is where we must achieve economic efficiency, and that's what we touched on in previous chapters, where we make the right mix of goods and services at the lowest possible cost, and what is known as full employment. We'll touch upon full employment later on in the class when we go through unemployment, but full employment means that we are employing the amount of our workforce we deem appropriate for our society. Every country has a different measure of full employment. And we'll get into that when we get into our unemployment chapter. So if we want to look at what happens with growth, remember, we can only produce up to the curve. So this is the PPC curve we looked at previously. So in our first example where I'm highlighting here, that is our original PPC curve. Now the curve kicks out to here, and that is growth. Meaning that all combinations of capital and consumer goods we can now make more of because we grew. Anytime you grow, you can now have more goods and services. So what actually determines output or growth here from the supply end? So the size of your employed labor force or your total workforce, remember, more workers, you will grow. Average hours of work, that's pretty straightforward. If they work more, you're going to grow as well. So the more hours that they work, we can have growth. So that's your labor inputs. That's how many people do we have working and how long do they work per day. And then the other side of the coin, technological advance, that'll drive growth. How many capital goods we have. Education and training, so not just how many workers do we have, but how educated are they. Allocative efficiency, so what are we taking our inputs and making with them, and any other factor, and that leads to labor productivity. So our total hours of work times our productivity or output per hour, that'll lead to our real GDP if we look at all of the workers in our economy. So if we look here from 1953 to 2017, we saw huge increases in real GDP in a couple points. So 1953 to 73, then we slowed down, then 95 to 2007, large increase again, then we slowed down 2007 to 17. That's a consequence of the large recession. And then they were projecting 2018 to 2029 and picking back up again. Whether or not that holds true, I'm not sure. These slides were made before COVID, and we had a huge slowdown for a few years, but then it picked back up again, so we will see. One thing to take in mind here, if we look, increase in quantity of labor right here. From 1953 to up to this 1995 here, we had much larger increases in our workforce than we do now. And the reason being is, think of what happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. You had large amounts of women that were not working entering the workforce. Our population was growing. So our quantity of labor was increasing by a large amount. Now, not so much. Now, pretty much the majority of men and women work, and our population is much more stable. So as a consequence, our quantity of labor is not changing very much anymore. But our labor productivity has been solidly increasing in every one of these time periods. And that is more of a function of education and technology than simply the number of workers we have. And that's something to keep in mind on the next slide. So things that affect growth. The biggest one is technological advance, responsible for 40% of all productivity growth. And once again, we're looking in the US here. So anytime we invent new technologies, that is your biggest driver of growth. The amount of capital goods comes in second, 30%. Once again, the more capital goods you have, the more we will be able to grow. Education and training and economies of scale and resource allocation are both around 15%. So education and training, by 2018, about 88% of the country had a high school diploma and 33% a college diploma, which is higher than it had ever been. Now high school diploma is over 90%, college is around 35%, so it's been increasing every year. So the better educated your workforce, the more productive they're going to be. the better trained. So it could be formal education like a degree, or it could be professional training, or both. And then resource allocation is important. What are we taking our inputs and using them for? Remember, we have to make the right mix of goods and services at the lowest possible cost. And if we look on the next slide, if we look right here, this is going to be the change in education. Once again, high school diplomas now 90% and college degrees 35% in 2018. And those are higher yet now. College is approaching 40% now, and high school is well over 90% in today's numbers. So we have been steadily increasing over the time periods. And a better educated population is a very important thing. That will mean that our workforce is more efficient and productive, driving growth. And this is just a selection of some test scores from various countries. So we were around 10th in 2015 here. So the United States does have some work to go in terms of education and standardized testing. But we are definitely growing in terms of education and the amount of people with degrees. So that's a very good thing. If we look here at productivity growth, once again, from 1973 to 1995, 1.5% per year. That almost doubled 1995 to 2010. And the reason it almost doubled, if we look here, that is a function of all of the technologies we got from the later 1990s and the up to about 2010. The computer revolution, and then the smartphone revolution. This all happened during this period of time. All of the technologies we take for granted now, the internet, and all of that, all came out of this time period. The modern internet, smartphones, modern computers, laptops, all of that stuff, and it caused growth to pick up tremendously. And then growth really dropped quite a bit from 2010 to 2018. So technologies have the power of causing a huge wave of growth when they're invented. And then the growth falls off until the next big technology comes out. We're trying to figure out what that is. You could argue it might be artificial intelligence. That's the thing, that's the buzzword everywhere right now. All of these AI technologies, ChatGPT, all of the stuff that is completely disrupting the previous order of things, that might be the next huge driver of growth. Or it might be something completely different that we haven't thought of yet. So when a new period of technologies come out, you get rapid growth, and then the growth falls off until the next round of technological advance. And regardless, growth affects real output, income, and wages. So the nice thing about growth, you could pay higher wages without lowering your profits. That's the beauty of economic growth. And if we look here, here is just growth of labor productivity in the United States. So technology in this period right here drove productivity. Think of how much more productive the internet and smartphones and everything made us. And now it's leveled off again until the next big technological change. You might, if AI becomes widely adopted, we might use it to become incredibly more productive again, and you'll see that line pick back up. That is a function of generally technological advance and other things as well, such as education and capital goods, but technology really drives that change. So why was there such a rise? I just gave it away, but all of the computers and devices we take for granted now, so microchip and information technology, all of the startup firms that happened during that time, all of the tech companies we now know really came from that period. And increasing returns from more specialized inputs, so focusing on sectors we may not have focused on before, spreading of development costs, simultaneous consumption, network effects, and learning by doing. All of these things are where these startup companies and all of these new technologies allowed us to grow. Also, global competition in this time period, a lot of former socialist countries, the former Soviet Union, all of that all collapsed and became much more free societies, leading to a lot more competition globally, which also drove growth as well. And if we look here, this is just the Global Competitive Index as of 2017 to 2018 of how competitive and innovative countries are. United States was number 2 behind Switzerland at that point. So why has productivity slowed down since 2010? Well, we came out of the severe recession in 2008, and afterwards, a few things happened. A lot of countries and individuals had a lot of debt. If you have high levels of debt, it's going to be much less attractive to keep investing in things like capital goods and more education and more technology. So that's one thing. There were overcapacity, so technology and capital goods not being used that didn't require new ones to be made or invented. Free internet apps. So free internet apps, once again, we covered this in GDP. They're not measured in GDP since they're offered free to consumers. So it's not really, their effect isn't really able to be quantified, even though they've certainly made us more productive. And finally, a slowdown in technological progress. So after all of the technologies we take for granted, we think they're modern, but I mean, smartphones in current form came out 2008, 2009. Laptops have been with us since the 90s, desktop computers since the 80s, the internet in its current form since the early 2000s. So all of that stuff are mature technologies now. We can use them in new and innovative ways, and sure, we add features. A smartphone now has better features than it did in 2010, but it can do broadly the same things, just better. So because of this, we're waiting for the next wave of technology. And in my opinion, AI tools are going to be the next wave in technology that really cause growth to pick back up again. So to bring us to our ultimate point for this chapter, is growth desirable? So once again, since the Industrial Revolution, we've argued that growth is the mission. We want rapid, sustained growth, and it brings all of those things like better standard of living and all of that. And that's 100% true. But the current argument you can make against growth generally revolves around things like environmental issues, climate change, and resource issues. So in defense of growth, it's been undoubtedly proven that every time we grow, we get a better standard of living, better lifespan, better technology, all of that. But some of the criticisms are the following. With growth comes pollution, climate change, resource depletion, and we've also could make the argument that even though we've grown, we still have problems like poverty and war and homelessness and discrimination. And while we've had a higher standard of living, it doesn't necessarily mean everybody has a better life. And the other problem is growth sustainable? The Earth has limited resources that are being consumed at really high rates. So you can make two arguments here, and there's no right answer. One is that growth in current form isn't sustainable, and we need to find a different trajectory of how to manage an economy. That the environmental problems and all of this need to be addressed. And also, growth may not be sustainable because a lot of countries, especially Western ones, have populations that have leveled off and have even started declining. Japan has the oldest population in the world, and their population is going to fall tremendously in the next few years. Not next few years, the next few decades. So that might stop growth. Also, we're using up resources that we may not be able to find replacements for. Think of oil and rare earth metals and all of this stuff we're consuming. But the flip side of this coin is the following. Human imagination can solve environmental and resource issues. Every time we've ever been faced with a huge issue, in the 1970s it was that we were all going to starve to death. Modern fertilizers and farming techniques fix that. You could make the argument that we will be able to invent technologies that can rectify climate change, or remove CO2 from the atmosphere, or allow us to have clean power. And that's certainly possible. We've always been able to do it before. As for resource issues, the Elon Musks of the world want to mine asteroids and get resources from other places, other planets, the moon, asteroids, and things like that. If we find a way to do that, that might solve our resource issues. Not just have to use the resources on this planet. So as a consequence, you could argue that imagination and technology will be able to allow us to continue to grow, maybe in ways we haven't even thought up yet. So there's no right or wrong answer to these topics. It remains to be seen. But in defense of growth, we have proven that growth is the path to greater material abundance, better standards of living, better medical care, better recreation, better technology. All of the benefits of our modern world are all a factor from growth. And they feel that the concerns can, once again, be dealt with as technology improves. And you can use the automobile industry here. Vehicles now are thousands of times cleaner than they were 20, 30 years ago. And now we're inventing things like electric cars and things that use alternative fuels. So it's been rapidly improving technology, and we can make that argument that we could do that with everything. So overall, the goal of any economic planner to this day is continued growth. And finally, as I said before about our workforce, as of 2018, 60% of all women are working, and women make up about half of the U.S. workforce, so the overwhelming majority of men and women work now. And women have earned the majority of college degrees since 1982, masters since 1987, and PhDs since 2008. So definitely a large chunk of the workforce, about half the workforce, and more educated than the male portion. But you're still facing discrimination where there is a pay gap between men and women, and that is something that we do need to rectify going forward, especially to have growth that is both sustainable and fair to everyone in society. So that's going to take us to the end of chapter number